Eleanor Whitaker had ironed that wedding dress herself. She had spent 3 hours the night before pressing every fold of white silk until it lay perfectly flat. The way her mother had taught her, the way she had always done everything in that house carefully. Quietly, without being asked, she had hung it on the door. She had gone to bed, and when she woke at dawn, the dress was gone. And her sister's room was full of laughter, and nobody in the family home of Albemarle County. Virginia had said her name once that morning, not once. If Eleanor's story reaches you today, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this woman's truth can travel. The church bells rang at 10 o'clock, and Eleanor counted every one of them. She was standing at the side of the building, pressed against the outer wall, where the elm tree blocked the sight line from the front entrance. And she counted the bells because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. 10. The hour, the exact hour her wedding was supposed to begin. Her wedding. She had to keep reminding herself of that. Because standing outside in the February cold while the guests filed through the front doors, it did not feel like her wedding. It felt like something happening to someone else, something she was watching from a distance. Through glass, unable to touch. She had walked the half-mile from the house alone. No one had offered to ride with her. No one had suggested she come at all. Actually, and she had understood from that silence what the morning was going to be. She had dressed herself in her second-best blue wool, pinned her hair without a mirror, and walked. The cold bit through her coat. She didn't move. Through the narrow gap in the side door she had found it without trying. The way a person always finds the one place they can see. Without being seen, she watched the pews fill. The Hendersons, the Wentworths, Judge Beaumont and his wife. Half of Albemarle County dressed in their good clothes. All of them talking, all of them comfortable, all of them entirely unaware that the woman who was supposed to be standing at that altar was standing outside in the cold counting church bells and trying to remember how to breathe. She heard Olivia before she saw her. Her sister's laugh carried. It always had. It was one of the things people loved about Olivia, that bright, effortless laugh that made a room feel warmer, that made men stand up straighter without knowing why. Eleanor had spent 26 years listening to that laugh from the next room. From the other side of a conversation, from just slightly too far away, to be part of whatever was happening. The music started inside, low and formal, the kind of music that meant things were beginning. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the elm bark and looked through the gap. Olivia appeared at the far end of the aisle. She was wearing the white silk dress with the pearl collar. Eleanor's grandmother's pearls, passed to the eldest daughter, passed. Specifically to Eleanor, because Eleanor was the eldest. The dress had been fitted to Eleanor's measurements in October. She had stood in the sewing room while Mrs. Holt pinned the seams and her mother supervised, and Olivia sat in the corner reading a magazine and complaining about having to sit still. Someone had let the seams out. Someone had dropped the neckline 2 inches. Someone had made that dress fit a different woman's body. Eleanor had found the altered correspondence in her author's desk 3 weeks ago. She had read it twice, set it back exactly as she'd found it, and not said a single word to anyone. That was the thing about being the invisible daughter. You learned early how to carry what you knew. You learned to fold it small and put it somewhere deep and go back to managing the household like nothing had shifted on its axis. She had managed the household for 12 years. She was very good at it. She watched Olivia walk. She watched her father beam from the front pew. His chest out, his chin up, the face he made at county meetings when he wanted people to see him as a man of consequence. She watched her mother press a handkerchief to her eyes. She watched the guests turn and murmur appreciatively, the way guests did. And then she looked at the man standing at the front of the church. Nathaniel Caldwell was not watching Olivia. He was looking at the side door. Eleanor's hand tightened on the elm bark. She knew Nathaniel's face well enough to read it 3 meetings. One of them 40 minutes long by the window at the Hendersons' autumn gathering. talking about clay soil and crop rotation while the party went on around them. She knew the way he held his jaw when he was deciding something. She knew the particular stillness that came over him when he was angry and choosing not to show it. He was showing it now, not loudly, not in a way most people in that church would read correctly. But his jaw was set in the way she recognized, and his eyes had found the gap in the side door. And he was not looking at the woman walking toward him in the white silk dress. He was looking at Eleanor. The music swelled. Olivia reached the front of the church. The minister cleared his throat. Nathaniel said, "That is not the woman I agreed to marry." The silence that followed was physical. Eleanor felt it like pressure against her ears. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Olivia had stopped mid-step, her bouquet held in both hands, her face cycling through expressions too fast to name. Her father was on his feet in the front pew before the echo of Nathaniel's words had finished moving through the church. "Now, Caldwell," her father started. "Where is Eleanor?" 2 words. Flat absolute. The voice of a man who had asked a question once and did not intend to ask it again. She was indisposed. She couldn't attend. "Where is Eleanor Whitaker?" Her father's eyes cut to the side door. To the gap, to the elm tree outside, to Eleanor. She saw the moment he found her. Saw his expression move through surprise, then calculation. Then something that might have been shame if he'd allowed it to stay long enough to name. He didn't. He was already composing his face into the look he used when he was managing a situation. "She's outside," said a woman's voice from the back of the church. Mrs. Wentworth. Said it without thinking, probably the way people say obvious things when they're nervous. The entire church turned toward the side door. Eleanor was not hidden. She had thought she was, but she wasn't. She was visible through the gap her dark coat, her pinned hair, her hand against the elm tree. She had been standing there the whole time. And now every person in Albemarle County who mattered socially was looking at her. "Then she should come in," Nathaniel said. He said it the way he said most things. As if it were a simple fact, as if any other outcome would require explanation. Eleanor did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she pushed the door open and walked into the church. She had been braced for shame. She had armored herself against it the whole walk over the staring. The whispers, the particular social cruelty of being publicly visible when you had spent years being publicly invisible. She had prepared herself to feel small. She did not feel small. She felt every eye in the room. She felt the weight of the staring and the whispers beginning at the back of the pews, and she walked directly toward the front of the church and kept her eyes on Nathaniel Caldwell and felt, underneath everything, something she didn't have a name for yet. He watched her walk. His expression did not change. But something in his posture adjusted an almost imperceptible shift. Like a man who has been waiting and has stopped waiting. She stopped a few feet from the front. Olivia was still standing in the aisle. 2 tears had escaped down her face, and she was looking at Eleanor with an expression that might have been apology if Olivia had been the kind of person who apologized. She wasn't. Eleanor knew that. She had known it for 20 years. Eleanor. Her father stepped forward, his voice low and stripped of its company manners. "This is not the time, Mr. Caldwell." Eleanor kept her voice level. She did not look at her father. "You stated that the woman before you is not the woman you agreed to marry." "That is correct," Nathaniel said. "May I ask how you know that? You've only met me 3 times. Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. "I read your agricultural assessments, the ones submitted to the county land office in September. I'd been told a man in your father's employ had written them." A pause. "That did not seem right to me," I asked around. Her father made a sound. "There was no deception," he said, pushing into the space between them. "There was a family decision, a practical one. Olivia is Whitaker." Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Who manages the account books for your estate?" Silence. "Eleanor does," her mother said from the pew. She said it quietly. Almost involuntarily, the way a person answers a direct question, before remembering they shouldn't. Who negotiated the revised terms with your grain supplier last spring when the harvest prices shifted? Her father's jaw was tight. That is not. Who drafted the drainage proposal for your south fields that your county representative brought to my attention 6 months ago? Saying it was some of the clearest agricultural thinking he'd seen in the county? Nobody answered. I know who, Nathaniel said. He turned to Olivia. His expression was not unkind, but it was the expression of a man closing a door. Miss Olivia, I mean you no disrespect, but I came here today to marry a specific woman. Your family made a change without informing me. That is not a change I accept. Olivia's chin dropped. A third tear followed the other two. Eleanor felt the complicated grief of it, not triumph. Nothing so clean. More like the feeling of watching something break that you had known for a long time was already cracked. Mr. Caldwell, she said, you don't have to do this. He looked at her. I beg your pardon. You don't have to intervene on my behalf. I understand the situation. I'm not asking you to. His voice was quiet and entirely firm. I made an agreement in good faith. That agreement was altered without my knowledge or consent. I am not stating facts. He paused. Do you want to be here or not? The question hit her somewhere undefended. She looked at him. She thought about 12 years of ledgers. She thought about the dress with the pearl collar. She thought about her mother's voice in the garden when Eleanor was 14, your sister is going to be beautiful, and the silence that followed. The silence that had become the architecture of her entire life. She thought about 40 minutes by a window in October, talking about clay and drainage and crop yield, and someone asking her questions because they wanted the actual answers. Yes, she said, I want to be here. The minister performed the ceremony. It was not elegant. Olivia was led to a side pew by two friends. Still crying, her father stood through the vows with the expression of a man suffering a private injury and refusing to acknowledge it. Her mother sat with her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and did not look up. The guests were entirely, absolutely silent, not the reverent silence of a wedding. The stunned silence of people witnessing something they had not been prepared for and would be discussing for the next 2 years. Eleanor stood in her dark blue wool dress with no flowers and her hair pinned without ceremony and said her vows in a clear, steady voice. Nathaniel said his in the same way. When it was done, he offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out into the February cold. The church door closed behind them. I owe you an explanation, he said. You don't owe me anything. You honored the original agreement. I know what I honored. I intend to explain myself anyway. She looked at him. Then do. I had your assessments for 6 months before I came to your father's house. A man at the county land office showed them to me. He thought they were mine at first. Said no woman had written them. A pause. He was wrong. And I knew it, because I had already been asking who you were for the better part of a year. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The cold was sharp. The road ahead led away from everything that had been her life. That isn't a romantic reason to propose a marriage arrangement, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. Most men would find it a peculiar one. Most men wouldn't have read the assessments. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. He was not warm, she was already understanding that warmth was not his natural register, but he was direct and without performance. And she had spent so long around performance that its absence felt like stepping into a room with good air. I should tell you, she said, that I have very little patience for being managed. I don't doubt it. If you married me expecting gratitude and compliance. I didn't. Then we may get along, she said. I reckon we might, he said. She looked at the road. She thought about the Whitaker house behind her, the books she had kept for 12 years. The Southfield drainage plan that had been sitting unanswered on her father's desk since September. I want to see the estate accounts, she said, today. If that's possible. He glanced at her, brief, measured. Today is fine. The current manager, how long has he been in the position? Carter. 17 years. And the yields over the last 4 seasons. A pause that told her something before he spoke. Below what the acreage should produce. By how much? Another pause. Longer, more than I'd like. She nodded once, filed it, and looked at the road ahead. Tell me about the south fields, she said. The carriage ride was 40 minutes. They spent most of it talking about land, not about the morning. Not about the church or her family, or what the county would say by nightfall. About soil composition and seasonal drainage and the specific challenges of the western acreage that bordered the creek. Nathaniel talked the way he did everything precisely, without decoration, with the occasional long pause that meant he was deciding how much to say. Eleanor asked questions the way she always had, directly, without apology, following each answer to its next logical point. Halfway through, she noticed him watching her, with an expression she couldn't fully read. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You were going to say something. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say that I expected this to be a more difficult conversation. Which part of it? Any of it. He looked out the window. Most people find the gaps in the yields uncomfortable to discuss. They explain them away, find reasons. He paused. You just ask the next question. The next question is where the answer usually is. He looked back at her. That brief, measured look again. Yes, he said, it is. They rode the rest of the way in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. The Caldwell estate was larger than she had imagined. She absorbed it as the carriage came up the drive, the scope of the main house, the outbuildings, the fields visible in the distance, the particular quality of land that had been worked for generations and bore the marks of it. Good land. She could see that even in February. Good land that was not performing the way good land should. She was already forming questions when the carriage stopped. William Carter was waiting at the entrance. He was broad and weathered, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had been in charge of something for a long time and had learned to make that fact known without announcing it. He shook Nathaniel's hand with the ease of long familiarity. He looked at Eleanor the way men like Carter always has looked at women like Eleanor, not with open hostility, just with the calm, settled certainty that she was decorative and temporary, and not worth the full weight of his attention. She recognized it. She had been looked at that way her entire life. Mr. Caldwell, Carter said. Heard there was some disruption at the church. The matter's resolved, Nathaniel said. Glad to hear it. Carter's gaze moved to Eleanor. Just briefly. The way you glance at furniture. Ma'am, Mr. Carter. Eleanor kept her voice pleasant. I'll need the account books for the past 4 years. This afternoon, if you're able. Carter looked at Nathaniel. Just for a half second, just enough. Nathaniel met his look without expression. My wife has asked for the accounts. Please have them ready. Something moved behind Carter's eyes. It didn't reach his face. Of course, he said. I'll see to it directly. He looked at Eleanor again. And this time she held his gaze until he looked away first. Ma'am. He walked away toward the outbuildings. Eleanor watched him go. He'll be a problem, she said quietly. Not a question. Nathaniel was quiet for a beat. Possibly. Has he been a problem before? He's been resistant to certain suggestions. Whose suggestions? He looked at her. Mine. She filed that too. A man who had been managing Nathaniel Caldwell's estate for 17 years and had grown comfortable enough to resist the owner's own suggestions. That was not a small thing. That was a man who believed his position was permanent and his authority unquestioned. She was going to need to be very careful and very thorough. I'll start with 1,815, she said. The books arrived at 4 o'clock. Eleanor was already at the study desk when Carter's man brought them in 4 years of ledgers. Thick and worn, stacked of that smelled of dust and old ink. The man set them down without speaking. Eleanor thanked him. He left without acknowledging it. She lit the lamp, pulled the first ledger open and began. The tea Nathaniel sent at 5 o'clock went cold. She didn't notice. The second candle he brought at 7 she used without looking up. When he appeared in the doorway at 8:30 to ask about supper, She said yes without breaking her reading, and when the food came, she ate with her left hand and kept her right hand moving down the columns. The first thing she found was the yield discrepancies. Consistent, careful, logged at volumes 5 to 8% below what the acreage and the seasonal records should have produced. Small enough to explain away in any single year. Accumulated over 4 years. They told a different story. The second thing was the supplier payments. Invoices on file for one amount, payments recorded for another. Never dramatically different. Always just slightly off. In the same direction, over and over. She sat with those two things for a long time. Then she turned to the 1,815 ledger, the oldest one in the stack, and worked her way to November and found the notation in the margin. Adjusted per agreement, see forwards, 2 initials. In Carter's handwriting. She stared at it. She turned back 3 pages. Forward 2. She found 2 more, both in the same hand. Both using the same phrase, both initialed. The dates were spread over 6 weeks in the autumn of 1,815. Adjusted per agreement. Agreement with whom? For what? She looked at the supplier entries for those weeks. Cross-referenced the payment records and found a gap, a payment made to a supplier not listed anywhere else in the ledger. One time. Record simply as materials, with no itemization. She sat back in her chair, the candle burned. The house was quiet. Outside, the Virginia night had settled in, fully cold and lightless. And somewhere in one of the outbuildings, William Carter was probably doing exactly what a man does when he believes he has nothing to worry about. Eleanor picked up her pen. She was not going to bring this to Nathaniel. Not yet. Not with fragments suggestive, yes, but not provable. Not the way she needed them to be provable. She had spent 12 years watching her father make decisions on insufficient information. And she had watched those decisions cost him, again and again. And she had promised herself a long time ago that she would never do the same. She was going to go through every page of every ledger. She was going to build a complete picture before she said a single word. She was going to do it the way she did everything, methodically. Quietly, without announcing herself until she had something worth announcing. She turned back to the beginning of the 1,815 ledger and started from the first page. Somewhere in the notation, adjusted per agreement, in Carter's steady, confident handwriting, was the beginning of something. She didn't know yet how large it was. She didn't know yet how deep it went, or how long it had been going on, or whether it went beyond Carter entirely. What she knew was this: she had been brought here because someone had finally, after 26 years, decided her mind was worth something. She was not going to waste that. The pen moved. The candle burned low. Eleanor Caldwell, the name still sat strange in her chest, like a key that almost fit worked through the night. And outside the window, the first thin clouds of a coming storm were beginning to cross the Virginia sky. And she did not see them, because she was reading. And she had just found the third notation, and this one had a different set of initials entirely. The third set of initials was not Carter's. Eleanor stared at them for a long time. The candle had burned to its last inch. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the window glass in long, low pulses. And the house had gone entirely quiet in the way houses go quiet after midnight when everyone inside has stopped pretending to be awake. She had been at the desk for 6 hours. She turned the page back. Forward. Cross-referenced the date November 14th, 1,815 against the payment ledger. There was an entry for that week. A sum paid out under the same materials notation, but this one was larger. Considerably larger. And beneath the standard bookkeeping entry, in a handwriting that was not Carter's and not any of the clerk's hands she had been reading for the past 6 hours, were 2 initials. She did not know who R.H. was. She wrote it down on the small piece of paper she had been using for notes, the third notation. The different initials, the date, the amount, and she set her pen down and sat back and let herself think. Carter, she understood. Carter was a man who had been in a position of unchecked authority for too long and had begun to treat the estate's money as a secondary resource. That was not uncommon. That was, in fact, one of the more predictable failures in estate management. She had seen the early signs of it in her own father's accounts years ago. Had flagged it, had been ignored. But Carter answering to someone. Carter making adjustments per agreement with a person who initialed estate ledgers in November of 1815, that was a different thing entirely. That was not a man helping himself quietly. That was a man operating inside a system. She needed to know how far the system went. She folded the piece of paper, tucked it into the front cover of the 1815 ledger, and stacked all 4 books neatly at the edge of the desk. Then she blew out what remained of the candle, sat for a moment in the dark, and made herself a list of rules. First, she would say nothing to Nathaniel until she had something complete enough to be actionable. Half a picture only gave a man the opportunity to move too soon. Second, she would give Carter no indication that she had found anything. She would ask her questions about ordinary things: yields, labor, seasonal rotation, and let him believe she was doing the kind of superficial review a new wife might do to feel useful. Third, she would find out who RH was. She went to bed at 2 in the morning. She lay in the unfamiliar dark of a room that was not her room, in a house that was not her house, in a marriage that was 11 hours old. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about initials. She was asleep within 4 minutes. She had always been practical about rest. She was at the desk again before dawn. Nathaniel found her there at 6:30 when he came downstairs. He stopped in the study doorway and looked at her, the ledgers open, the new candle burning, her pen already moving, and said nothing for a moment. "You slept," he said finally. "4 hours. I'm fine, Eleanor." She looked up. He was studying her with that direct, measuring look she was already beginning to recognize as his default mode of attention. Not soft, not concerned in any sentimental way, just present. Paying attention the way very few people actually paid attention. "The accounts are worse than you indicated yesterday," she said. "I indicated they were below where they should be, significantly below. And not because of weather or market variation." She paused. "Let that settle. I'd like to ask you some questions about the suppliers." Something moved in his expression. Brief, controlled. "After breakfast," he said. "Now would be better. A beat." Then he walked into the study, pulled the chair from the corner, and sat across from her. She respected that. She did not say so. "The grain supplier," she said. "Hollis and Sons. How long have you used them?" "Since before I acquired the estate." "They were Carter's recommendation originally." 12. 13 years. "Have you ever reviewed their invoicing directly?" "Yourself, personally?" "I reviewed the summaries Carter provided, not the original invoices." "No." She turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on a line. "This payment, March 1817. The summary Carter gave you, do you remember what it said?" He looked at the entry. His jaw shifted. The summary listed it at $42. The original invoice on file lists it at $38. Silence. "A $4 difference," she said, "in one transaction. Over 4 years and the number of transactions this estate runs. Those $4 differences accumulate." She paused. "I've found 23 of them so far. I haven't finished the 1814 ledger yet." Nathaniel did not move. He was looking at the ledger entry with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not enjoying the results. "Carter," he said partially. She kept her voice even. "There's more I need to verify before I can give you a complete picture. I want 2 more days with the books before we discuss it further." He looked up from the ledger. "Why 2 days?" "Because I want to be certain. Not mostly certain." "Certain." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. 2 days. "In the meantime," she said, "I'd like to walk the South Fields this morning." "With you?" "Not with Carter. and I'd like it to appear routine. You don't want Carter to know what you're doing. I don't want Carter to know what I've found. There's a difference. She closed the ledger. Can you arrange the walk without making it seem like more than a new wife wanting to see the land? The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. I reckon I can manage that, he said. Carter met them at the edge of the south fields. He had his hat in his hands, and his expression set to the particular combination of deference and authority that Eleanor had seen in men like him before the performance of a subordinate who had long since stopped believing he was one. He walked the field line with them, pointing out the winter fallow sections, explaining the rotation schedule, using the practiced ease of a man who had given this speech many times. Eleanor listened. She asked questions that were not her real questions. What was the yield on this section last harvest? About 30 bushels to the acre. Ma'am. Reasonable for the season. The county average for comparable land was closer to 38, she said pleasantly. Is the soil composition different here? Carter looked at her. Just briefly. The look of a man recalibrating. We had some drainage trouble in the spring, he said. Set us back some, I see. And the section to the west, same issue, similar. And the north quarter? A pause. Shorter than it should have been. Yes, ma'am. So drainage affected the yields across all 3 sections.
That's right.
She nodded thoughtfully. The way a woman nods when she is accepting an explanation. She was not accepting the explanation. She was recording it. Precisely and completely, because she had spent the morning with the 1,814 records and the drainage issue Carter was describing had not appeared in a single notation. Not in the maintenance logs, not in the labor records. Not anywhere in the paperwork that a real drainage problem would have generated. There had been no drainage problem. He was lying to her face, calmly and fluently, in the way of a man who had been doing it so long, he had stopped feeling the shape of it. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she said. That's very helpful. He nodded. Looked at Nathaniel. Something unspoken moved between them, the look of a man checking whether his authority was still intact. Nathaniel looked back at him without expression. Carter put his hat back on and walked toward the outbuildings. Eleanor waited until he was out of earshot. He's lied about the drainage, she said quietly. You're certain? There's nothing in the maintenance records that supports it. A drainage problem significant enough to affect 3 sections simultaneously would have required labor. Materials, probably a consult with a land engineer. None of it's recorded. She paused. Either it didn't happen, or someone removed the records. Either way, it's deliberate. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and very controlled. How long has this been going on? I don't know yet, she said. That's what the next 2 days are for. She found the second layer on the afternoon of the second day. She had been working backward from the supplier discrepancies, cross-referencing every payment against every receipt, building a timeline of the gaps. The pattern was clear enough by now. Carter had been skimming from the supplier payments, inflating the recorded costs and pocketing the difference. It was not a small sum over 4 years. It was enough to matter significantly. But the adjusted per agreement notations were separate from that. Those were not skimming. Those were payments made in full, recorded honestly in terms of amount, but categorized incorrectly, buried under materials and general expenses in ways that obscured where the money was actually going. Those payments were not going to Carter. She found the land deed by accident. She had asked the house steward, a quiet older man named Josiah, for any filed correspondence relating to the western boundary of the estate. She was checking a discrepancy in the acreage records and needed the original survey documentation. Josiah had brought her a box of papers from the estate archive, apologizing for the disorder, explaining that Mr. Carter managed most of the filing. She had thanked him and gone through the box methodically. The survey documents were there. So were the original boundary agreements. And tucked between 2 pages of a boundary survey from 1813 was a document that had no business being in that box at all. It was a promissory note, signed by Nathaniel Caldwell. Except the signature was wrong. She had seen Nathaniel's signature on the ledgers, on estate correspondence, on the formal documents he had reviewed with her that morning. She knew the specific formation of his capital letters, the particular angle of his name. This signature had the right letters in roughly the right order and was wrong in every way that mattered. It was dated October 1815. The amount was substantial enough to make her sit very still for a moment. And at the bottom of the document, in the section indicating the party to whom the note was owed, was a name: Robert Haverford. R.H. Eleanor set the document down on the desk with the same care she used for everything that mattered. She straightened it until its edges were parallel with the edge of the desk. She looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 3 words on her notepad. Forgery. Haverford. October 1815. She thought about what this meant. Carter had been skimming from supplier payments that was his own operation. Small and private and entirely his, but the adjusted per agreement entries, the money flowing out under false categories, the promissory note in Nathaniel's forged name, that was something Carter had been doing for someone else. A man named Robert Haverford had, at some point in the autumn of 1815, acquired a claim against the Caldwell estate based on a document that Nathaniel had never signed. If that note was ever presented to a court, to a bank, to anyone with the authority to act on it, Nathaniel could lose a substantial portion of what he owned. Maybe more than a portion, and Carter knew it existed. Carter had been making payments against it for 4 years. She sat with the full shape of it for a moment, letting it settle. Then she went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the far barn, talking to one of the field workers about the spring planting calendar. He saw her face when she came through the door and ended the conversation in one sentence. The worker left. They were alone. "What did you find?" he said. She held out the promissory note. He took it. "Read it." She watched him read it, watched his attention to recognition, to something much colder and more controlled. "I didn't sign this," he said. "I know. This isn't my signature. I know. I've been looking at your signature for 2 days. She paused. "The date is October 1815. Do you know a man named Robert Haverford?" He went very still. That stillness was different from his usual stillness. This was not the controlled quiet of a man deciding how much to say. This was something else, something with edges. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the estate archive, filed with the boundary survey documents from 1813. Hidden well enough that no one would find it unless they were specifically looking through that box, which you were. I was looking for the acreage records. I found this instead." She paused. "Nathaniel, who is Robert Haverford?" He looked at her. His jaw was set, his eyes were hard. And then slowly, something in his face changed, not softened, but shifted. In the way a door shifts when someone on the other side stops holding it closed. "Robert Haverford," he said, "is the man who sent you this estate." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had heard since the church. "He sold it to you," she said carefully, "in 1814. It was his family's land. He needed to liquidate. I had the money. The transaction was legal, documented, witnessed." He looked at the forged note in his hand. "We did not part on good terms." A pause. Long enough that she almost asked again, because when I reviewed the estate accounts after the purchase, he said, I found evidence that he had misrepresented the property's financial condition during the sale. I confronted him. He denied it. I was prepared to pursue the matter legally. Another pause. He told me I would regret it. Eleanor looked at the promissory note. "And then Carter," she said. "Carter was here before I bought the estate. He was Haverford's man." Nathaniel set the note on the nearest surface and looked at it. I kept him on because he knew the land and the workers, and replacing him entirely would have created problems, Eleanor said. You told me that on the carriage ride, yes. What you didn't tell me was that Carter was Haverford's man, a beat. No, he said. She held his gaze, why not? He was quiet for a moment. The barn settled around them, the sounds of the estate horses shifting. The distant call of a worker, the wind moving through the gaps in the old wood, filling the silence between them. Because I didn't know, he said finally, how much of it Carter knew. I suspected the accounts were off, I didn't know why. I didn't know whether Carter was complicit or simply incompetent. He paused. And because I had just married a woman I had met 3 times, and I was not yet certain how much, he stopped. How much to tell me, she finished. Yes, she thought about that. She thought about what it cost a man like Nathaniel Caldwell to say that sentence, to admit, even indirectly, that he had been uncertain, that he had withheld, that he had not known how far to trust her. She did not say, "You should have trusted me." She was not sure she would have trusted him either. 3 meetings in on the first day. All right, she said. Here's what I know. She laid it out for him plainly, the supplier discrepancies, the false yield records, Carter's lie about the drainage, the adjusted per agreement entries, the payments flowing out to a name she now had. Carter has been paying Haverford against this note for 4 years. The note is forged, which means either Carter knows it's forged and is paying anyway, which would mean he's working under some kind of threat, or Carter believes it's legitimate, which is more likely. Carter is not a stupid man, she said. I think he knows. Nathaniel looked at the note. If Haverford presents this to a court, he won't. Not yet, she kept her voice steady. A forged promissory note is only useful as a threat. The moment you present it to a court, you open it to scrutiny. Haverford knows you'd fight it, and he knows that under examination the forgery would likely be detected. She paused. He's not trying to collect. He's trying to drain. Quiet. Over you. Through Carter. He's bleeding the estate without ever having to put the document in front of a judge. Nathaniel looked at her. She met his eyes and waited. You worked all of that out, he said. In 2 days. I worked all of that out in 2 days from incomplete records. With full access to the correspondence files and the original purchase documents, I can build a complete account. She paused. I need those files. They're in the locked cabinet in the East Room. I'll open it this afternoon. Good. She picked up the promissory note from where he'd set it and held it carefully by the edge. I'm going to take this apart. Every element of it, the paper, the ink, the notary seal, the witness signatures. I want to document exactly what makes it false. When this goes to a court, and it will go to a court, I want the argument to be so complete that no one can question it. He was looking at her with that expression again. The one she'd caught in the carriage. The one she didn't quite have a name for. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You keep saying nothing. I keep meaning it, he said. In the sense that nothing is wrong. A pause. I was thinking that you are considerably more than your family gave you credit for. It landed somewhere unguarded. She looked away briefly, at the barn wall, at nothing in particular, and let the moment pass. Most people are, she said. When someone bothers to look. She had the East Room files by 3 o'clock. She also had by 4 the beginning of a problem she hadn't anticipated. It started in the kitchen, where she had gone to ask the housekeeper about the estate's historical labor records. She needed the worker logs from 1815 to cross-reference the dates of the adjusted per agreement entries. The housekeeper, a small, composed woman named Mrs. Albright, had given her the information without hesitation and had also, in the way of women who manage houses and see everything, given her something else. The men are talking, Mrs. Caldwell, she said it quietly, without drama. The way a person delivers information they consider important. Eleanor looked at her. What are they saying? That Mr. Carter told them you'd be reviewing the accounts. That it's normal for a new mistress to want to look at the books. That it won't change anything. She paused. He said it in a way that implied you wouldn't find anything worth changing. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When did he say this? Yesterday evening. After supper. In the workers' quarters. Most of the indoor staff. 3 of the field supervisors. Mrs. Albright's hands were folded in front of her. Very still. I thought you should know. I appreciate it, Eleanor said. And then, because the woman had taken a risk to tell her and deserved more than a dismissal. How long have you worked here, Mrs. Albright? 11 years. Ma'am, since before Mr. Caldwell bought the estate. Then you worked under Haverford. A pause. Careful. I did. Was Carter different then, before the sale, Mrs.? Albright looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask that question. Mr. Carter was always Mr. Carter, she said. But under Mr. Haverford he had more latitude. When Mr. Caldwell took over, some of that latitude was reduced. Mr. Carter did not take to the reduction. She paused again. He's a man who finds ways to preserve what he believes is his. Yes, Eleanor said. I've noticed. She went back to the study with the labor records and a new problem to think about. Carter knew she was looking. He had gotten ahead of it, told the staff it was routine. Framed it as a new wife's curiosity, made it small before it could become something bigger. That was smart. It was exactly what she would have done in his position. Which meant she had less time than she'd thought. She had been planning to spend another 3 or 4 days building the documentation before bringing a complete picture to Nathaniel. That timeline had just collapsed. If Carter moved first, if he found a way to dispute her findings, or removed evidence, or got ahead of her with Nathaniel, the advantage she had built in 2 days of careful, quiet work would vanish. She needed to move faster. And she needed one more thing before she could do that. She needed someone who could confirm what Haverford was. She asked Nathaniel at dinner. It was the first time they had eaten together without one of them reading something. And it was not entirely comfortable, but it was honest. Which she was already deciding she preferred. Robert Haverford, she said. Where does he live now? Nathaniel looked up from his plate. Charlottesville. He has a house there. Practices law. I'm told, though I've heard the practice is not what it was. He's a lawyer, was. He still holds the title. Does he have other interests in this county? Land, business, any other connections? He has a brother-in-law on the county land board. Nathaniel set down his fork. James Pruitt. Eleanor quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Pruitt, she said. The man who showed you my agricultural assessments. The expression on Nathaniel's face shifted. Yes. She thought about that. She thought about a county land board official who had connections to Haverford, who had shown Nathaniel those assessments, who had presumably known exactly who had written them and who Nathaniel would pursue as a result. Did Pruitt encourage you to pursue the arrangement with my family? She asked. Nathaniel was very still. He mentioned your father's estate as a possible connection. Said the family had a daughter with an unusually practical mind for estate management. A pause. He was complimentary. He was steering, Eleanor said quietly. He was making sure you ended up connected to someone useful. Useful to whom? She looked at him. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. She picked up her fork. Set it down again. I need to go to Charlottesville. Absolutely not. The words were flat and immediate. And she looked at him with an expression that made him stop. Explain yourself. Her voice was even, not angry, but very clear. He met her eyes. Haverford is not a safe man to approach directly. If he knows someone is building a case against him, I'm not going to approach him directly. I'm going to the county records office. I want the original land transfer documents from 1814. The notary records from that quarter and anything filed under Haverford's name in the years before the sale. She paused. Those are public documents. Any person has the right to review them. A silence. A woman traveling alone to Charlottesville. Is a woman traveling alone to Charlottesville, she said. I've done more difficult things than that. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. Spent her entire life looking away when men needed her to. And she was not going to do it in her own marriage at the first substantial disagreement. "I'll come with you," he said finally. "You can't. If Carter sees you leave for Charlottesville 2 days after I start reviewing the accounts, he'll know something is happening. I need you to stay here and act as though everything is normal." She paused. "I'll take Josiah. He's been with the estate long enough to be unremarkable. And I believe he's trustworthy." "What makes you believe that?" "Because Carter didn't include him in the conversation yesterday evening. He gathered everyone he needed to manage. He left Josiah out." She paused. "That either means Josiah isn't important enough to bother with, or it means Carter doesn't trust him and knows a direct approach would be pointless." She paused again. "I don't think Carter misjudges people." Nathaniel was quiet. He looked at her with that expression. She couldn't fully read the one that was not quite admiration, and not quite surprise, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "You trust the housekeeper," he said. "Mrs. Albright came to me voluntarily with information she didn't have to share. She took a risk doing it. That tells me something about her." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I trust people who take quiet risks for the right reasons. It's a more reliable indicator than most." He was silent for a long moment. "Charlottesville is a full day's ride," he said. "I know. You'll leave tomorrow. If you can arrange for Josiah to be available without Carter noticing." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his fork. "When you come back," he said. "I want the full picture." "When I come back," she said. "You'll have it." They finished dinner without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had just decided, without quite saying so, that they were going to face this together, not because they'd chosen to trust each other out of sentiment, but because they had looked at the situation clearly and found that they were, in fact, pointing in the same direction. Eleanor Caldwell had come to this estate 2 days ago with nothing but a blue wool dress and a mind that her own family had spent 26 years trying to convince her wasn't worth much. She was beginning to think that might have been the greatest miscalculation anyone had ever made about her. In the locked East Room, Haverford's forged promissory note sat between 2 clean sheets of paper, carefully preserved, building its own quiet case. And in Charlottesville, a man who believed himself untouchable had no idea that the woman he had never bothered to consider was already 3 steps into taking him apart. Josiah was waiting at the stable before first light. Eleanor had told him the night before, briefly and without elaboration, that she needed to ride to Charlottesville to review county records. She had watched his face while she said it, and seen nothing there that concerned her, no flicker of calculation, no sideways glance toward the outbuildings where Carter's quarters were. Just a nod, quiet and immediate, the nod of a man who understood that some requests didn't require explanation. She had been right about him. She was usually right about people. It was one of the few advantages of spending 26 years being overlooked. You learned to read the ones who were overlooking you. The road to Charlottesville was cold and mostly empty at that hour. Josiah drove without talking, which she appreciated. She sat with the copies she had made of the key ledger entries, not the originals, which she had locked in the East Room desk, and went through them one more time in the thin early light, checking her reasoning, looking for the place where she might be wrong. She didn't find one. That didn't mean it wasn't there. They reached Charlottesville by late morning. The county records office was a squat brick building 2 streets off the main road, staffed by a clerk who looked at Eleanor with the mild surprise men in administrative positions always showed when a woman came in asking for specific documents rather than directions to the nearest dry goods store. "I need the land transfer records for the Caldwell estate," she said. "The original sale documents from 1814 and any notary filings under the name Robert Haverford for the period of 1813 through 1816. The clerk blinked. "Ma'am, those records are public documents," she said pleasantly. "Filed with this office and available for review by any citizen." I understand the 1,814 records may take a few minutes to locate. I'm happy to wait. He located them in 20 minutes. She read them in 45. The land transfer was clean. Properly executed, correctly witnessed, notarized by a man named Daniel Fitch, whose seal appeared on dozens of other documents in the same period, a working notary with a legitimate practice. Nothing wrong with the sale itself, but in the notary filings for 1,815, she found Daniel Fitch's name again, on a document that was not a land transfer and not a standard commercial agreement. It was a witnessed attestation of debt, the legal framework that would make the promissory note enforceable. Signed by Fitch, dated 3 weeks after the forged note. Fitch had notarized the forgery, whether knowingly or not. She couldn't yet say, but the seal that made the forged promissory note look legitimate was Fitch's. And Fitch's practice was in Charlottesville, and Robert Haverford had been Fitch's client for at least 3 years based on the filing record she was looking at. She wrote it all down, dates, document numbers, the precise wording of the attestation. She asked the clerk for a copy of the attestation. He charged her 15 cents and gave it to her without meeting her eyes, which told her he had read enough of what she was looking at to be uncomfortable. She thanked him and walked out into the winter air. Josiah was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and asked no questions. "One more stop," she said. The law offices of Haverford and Associates were on the main street. Above a tailor's shop, the sign was freshly painted, which was often the sign of a practice trying to look more stable than it was. She had not told Nathaniel she was going here. She had told him she was going to the records office, which was true, and she had not mentioned anything further, which was a different kind of true. She did not go inside. She stood across the street and watched the entrance for 20 minutes. 2 men came out in that time, neither of them matching the description she had assembled in her mind from the estate records and Mrs. Albright's careful, word-by-word account of the man she had worked under before the sale. A lawyer, mid-40s, precise dresser, walked with the deliberate confidence of a man who had more power than he currently did and hadn't accepted the reduction. On the 17th minute, that man came out of the building. He stopped on the step to speak to someone inside. She could hear his voice from across the street. Not the words, just the tone. Authoritative, slightly impatient. The voice of a man who expected to be listened to. Then he turned and walked up the street, away from her. And she watched him go and memorized everything she could about the shape of his certainty. Robert Haverford had no idea she existed. He had engineered a slow financial bleed on Nathaniel's estate through a man he'd placed there years ago, and he had done it with enough distance and enough layers that he probably believed himself entirely insulated. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet, and the gap between what he knew and what was true was the only advantage she had. And she was not going to close it a single moment before she was ready. She turned back to Josiah and the horses. "We can go home," she said. She was back at the estate before dark. Nathaniel met her in the front hall. He looked at her with the controlled tension of a man who had spent the day acting normal while not feeling it. And she recognized that expression because she had worn it herself for 12 years. "The records office," she said before he could ask. "And I found what I needed." She kept her coat on and walked directly to the study. He followed. She spread the copies on the desk, the attestation, the notary records, the cross-reference dates, and laid them out in order. "Fitch notarized the forgery," she said. "He may not have known what he was attesting to. The document could have been presented to him as a legitimate debt record with the signature already in place. Or he may have known exactly what it was." She paused. "Either way, his seal is what makes the note look enforceable. Without the notarization, it's just a piece of paper with a bad signature on it." Nathaniel was looking at the documents. His expression had the particular quality of controlled anger she was beginning to understand was his version of fury, everything pressed down and held in place by sheer discipline, visible only in the stillness of his hands. Can it be challenged, he said. The notarization can be challenged if we can demonstrate that the underlying document is fraudulent. Which we can, because the signature is forged and I can prove it through comparison with your verified signatures on the purchase documents from 1814. Which Fitch himself also notarized. She paused. He notarized your real signature. He notarized the forgery, put them side by side, and the difference is not subtle. Then we take it to a judge. Not yet, he looked up from the documents. We take it to a judge now, and Haverford knows we're moving against him. He has a brother-in-law on the county land board, connections to the local legal community. Time and resources to complicate the proceedings. She set her pen down. We take it to a judge when we have everything. The forgery. The 4 years of fraudulent payments. Carter's role. The original purchase records, the yield discrepancies. All of it. We build a case so complete that there is no procedural angle he can use to delay or deflect. She paused. We have one chance to do this right. I want to use it correctly. The silence that followed was long. How much longer, he said. A week. Maybe 10 days. She looked at him. I know that's not what you want to hear. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment. But you're right. He said it without decoration. The way he said most things, and she had already learned that this was worth more coming from him than from most men, because he did not say things he didn't mean. There's something else, she said. He waited. Carter knows I'm looking. He spoke to the staff 2 nights ago, framed my review as routine. Tried to make it small before it could become something. I think he's going to move. She paused, maybe not against the documents. But he may try to discredit me with you. Establish a version of events before I can establish mine. He won't find that ground easy, Nathaniel said. He's been working this estate for 17 years. He knows how to be persuasive. She looked at Nathaniel steadily. I'm not telling you this because I think you're easily managed. I'm telling you because you need to know what's coming, so you don't react to it before you have to. He looked at her for a long moment. You're warning me. I'm informing you. There's a difference. Something shifted in his expression. Not the almost smile she'd seen before. Something quieter. All right, he said. When he comes to you, and he will let him talk. Don't confirm or deny anything. Tell him you appreciate his concern and you'll look into it. Then come and tell me what he said, word for word. Word for word, he repeated. The specific language a man uses when he's trying to protect himself tells you more than the argument he's making, she said. I need to know what he's actually afraid of. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. Word for word, he said again. Carter came to Nathaniel the following morning. Eleanor was in the east room when it happened. She heard the knock on the study door. Heard the low rumble of voices without being able to make out the words. And she kept working and did not try to listen. She had asked for a report, not a performance. She was not going to stand outside a door with her ear pressed against the wood like a woman in a story. She had her own work to do. She was building the comparison document, Nathaniel's verified signatures lined up against the forged one, annotated with specific points of difference in a format that a judge or a lawyer could follow without specialized knowledge. She had been at it since 6 that morning, and she was most of the way through. Nathaniel came to the east room 40 minutes later. She looked up. His expression was controlled in the particular way it got when he was deciding how to say something. He told me, Nathaniel said, that you've been asking the staff irregular questions. That you've been looking at records outside the scope of ordinary household management. That he's concerned you may be misinterpreting information you don't have the context to understand properly. He paused. He was respectful about it, very measured. What else? He suggested that the accounts were complex and that it might be advisable, if I had concerns about estate management, to bring in a professional, a man with specific training in agricultural accounting rather than rely on. And I'm giving you the exact words, a well-intentioned but inexperienced domestic perspective. Eleanor set down her pen. He used the word domestic, she said. He did. She thought about that. She thought about what it told her about Carter's strategy, not just the content of it, but the precision of the word. Not unintelligent. Not wrong. Domestic. It was a word designed to reframe her without attacking her. To put her back in a box without making Nathaniel feel he was being asked to put his wife in a box. It was well done. She gave him that. He's not wrong that the accounts are complex, she said. He's also not wrong that I lack context for some of what I've found. That's exactly what makes the argument effective. It's true enough that you can't dismiss it outright. She paused. What did you say to him? I told him I appreciated his concern and I'd look into it. Word for word. She nodded slowly. He'll interpret that as uncertainty on your part. He'll think he got through. She picked her pen back up. Good. Let him think that for a few more days. You're using him thinking he's ahead to buy time, Nathaniel said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. It occurs to me, he said, that you are considerably more comfortable with strategy than most people I know. I grew up in a house where I had no formal authority and no social standing, and everything I wanted to accomplish required working around other people's assumptions, she said. Without looking up from the document, you develop certain skills. He was quiet for a moment. Carter asked me one other thing, he said. She looked up. He asked whether you had found anything in the East Room files. A pause. Specifically the East Room. The air in the room shifted. Eleanor set her pen down very deliberately. He knows about the East Room files, apparently, which means he knows the forged note was in the archive box. She was already on her feet. How long ago did you have the East Room opened? Before I asked you to, I haven't had it opened. Not since I filed the original purchase documents there in 1814. Who else has access to the key? Carter has a copy. Standard estate management, he needs access to the historical property records for land boundary disputes. Survey references. He paused. He's been in there. She was already moving toward the locked cabinet. She unlocked it, opened it, looked through the files in the order she had left them. She had a precise memory for the arrangement of documents. Had developed it over 12 years of other people disturbing her filing systems, and found it. The forged promissory note was gone. She stood at the open cabinet for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she turned around. Nathaniel was in the doorway. His face had gone very still. He took it, she said. When? While I was in Charlottesville, or last night? It doesn't matter when. She kept her voice level because losing composure now would cost her time she didn't have. What matters is that he's moved it, which means he knows I found it. Which means we've lost the element of surprise. We've also lost the primary evidence. We've lost his copy of it. She turned back to the cabinet and pulled out a folder. I made a copy of the document before I locked it away. Exact dimensions, all the text, the notary seal reproduced as precisely as I could manage in writing. And I have the attestation from the Charlottesville Records Office, the official filing that references the note by date and amount. The note itself is gone, but its existence is documented. She paused. It's not as strong as having the original, but it's not nothing. Can we prove the copy's accurate? I can testify to it. Mrs. Albright was in this room the afternoon I was working on the documents. She brought tea, and I was holding the original note at the time. She saw it. Eleanor closed the cabinet. That's a witness. Nathaniel crossed the room and stood next to her at the cabinet, looking at the folder in her hands. She could feel the controlled anger coming off him in waves held tight, directed inward, the kind of anger that became more dangerous the quieter it got. I want Carter off this property, he said. Not yet. Eleanor, if you remove him now. Haverford knows we're moving. Carter will go directly to him. Haverford will have time to build his defense, move the note somewhere we can't trace it. Call in whatever legal resources he has. She looked at Nathaniel directly. We have 5 days, maybe 6, before Carter realizes the copy isn't going to stop us. Give me those 5 days. His jaw was tight. And if he takes something else, he's already taken the most valuable thing. Everything else is secondary. She paused. And I've moved the secondary things. He looked at her. When last night? After you told me what he said to you. I moved every document I considered significant to a location Carter doesn't have access to. She met his eyes. I was a woman who kept her family's accounts for 12 years while nobody paid attention. I know how to secure what matters. The anger in Nathaniel's face did something complicated. It didn't disappear. But underneath it, something else was there. Something that was not anger and not the measured respect she had already come to recognize. Something less controlled than either of those things. He looked days, he said. 5 days, she said. She used all 5 of them. She worked through the labor records and found the discrepancies Carter had been hiding in the worker. Ledgers inflated headcounts on days when the full crew wasn't present. The difference pocketed against the payroll. She built the supplier comparison every invoice against every payment for 4 years. The accumulated gap documented to the dollar. She wrote out the yield analysis using the county agricultural records she had pulled from her father's own files. The ones she had maintained for 12 years, which documented regional averages she could compare directly against the Caldwell records. She also talked to people. She did it quietly, in the way she had always gathered information, not interrogations. Just conversations. A question to one of the field workers about how the harvest had actually gone last September, framed as genuine curiosity from a new mistress who wanted to understand the land. A conversation with Mrs. Albright about the household budget over the past 3 years, which led to 3 new inconsistencies she hadn't found in the ledgers. An offhand question to the stable hand about suppliers, which ones Carter dealt with personally, which ones went through the main house accounts. By the 4th day, she had something she hadn't had on the 1st day. Testimony, not formal testimony, not yet. But 3 workers who had observed Carter conduct that contradicted his documented records, who were willing to say so to someone with the authority to act on it. She brought it to Nathaniel on the evening of the 4th day. She spread everything on the study desk, the complete account, organized chronologically, annotated with sources. The supplier fraud, the yield falsification, the forged promissory note, documented through her copy, and the Charlottesville attestation. Carter's connection to Haverford, the payments flowing out. The testimony she had gathered. Nathaniel read it. All of it. He was quiet for a long time. "This is enough," he said finally. "It's more than enough," she said. "But I want a lawyer to review it before we move. Someone not connected to Haverford's network, not local if we can help it." She paused. "Do you know anyone in Richmond?" "I know a man named Foster. He represented me during the original estate purchase. He's careful and he doesn't take cases he can't win." Nathaniel looked up from the papers. "I'll write to him tonight. Tell him we need him here within the week. And tell him to come quietly." She paused. "We also need to address Carter directly before Foster arrives. If Carter figures out what we're doing before we're ready to move formally, he'll disappear and Haverford will have time to reorganize. You want to confront Carter? I want to give Carter a choice," she said. "Before this goes to a judge, Carter can tell us everything he knows about Haverford's operations, where the note is now, what other claims Haverford may have prepared, who else is involved. In exchange for his cooperation, his situation becomes considerably less serious than it would otherwise be." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "And if he refuses, then he faces the full accounting with Haverford. And the full accounting is not something either of them will walk away from easily." She paused. "Carter is not a stupid man. He knows what the ledgers show. He knows that the moment a competent lawyer looks at 4 years of records, the picture is not ambiguous." She paused again. "He took the note because he was afraid. A man who is afraid can be reasoned with. What he's afraid of is losing everything. The question is whether he's more afraid of us or more afraid of Haverford. And you think it's us. I think it's becoming us," she said. 4 days ago it was Haverford. But Haverford isn't here. And Carter has been watching me work for 5 days now. And he is not a man who underestimates a clear threat when it's sitting across the table from him. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. When do we speak to him? Early. Before the staff is active. She looked at him. I'd like you there, of course. But I'll do the talking. He was quiet for half a beat. Then all right. She looked at him. She had expected. Somewhere in the back of her mind a qualifier. A within reason or an if you think that's best. She had not gotten one. He had simply said all right the way he agreed to things he meant. There's one more thing, she said. She picked up the last piece of paper on the desk, a letter that had arrived that afternoon. Delivered by a writer she hadn't recognized. This came while you were at the North Field. He took it. Read it. His expression went very still. She waited. It's from Haverford, he said. Yes, he's claiming the promissory note is due. 30 days. He set it down. He's moved up his timeline. He knows Carter took the document. He knows we found it. She kept her voice steady. He's trying to force us into a defensive position, make us spend the next month dealing with the legal claim rather than building the fraud case. Can he get a judgment in 30 days, not a final one? But he can get a preliminary hearing, and in a preliminary hearing the note looks legitimate because it has Fitch's notarization on it, and we don't have the original to contest directly. She paused. He's trying to get in front of a judge before we do. Then we need Foster here faster than a week. I wrote to him this afternoon, she said. I used your name. I hope that was acceptable. Nathaniel looked at her. Something moved in his face, that expression again. The one she was still mapping. You wrote to Foster already. I thought it was likely we'd need to move faster. She met his eyes. I should have told you. I'm sorry for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then don't apologize for thinking ahead. Just tell me next time. Yes, she said. I will. She meant it. She was learning him the way she learned everything, carefully. By observation, adjusting as the picture became clearer. He was not a man who wanted to control her thinking. He was a man who wanted to be inside it, which was a different thing entirely and considerably easier to work with. Outside, the night had come down cold and full, and somewhere in Charlottesville, Robert Haverford was sitting with 30 days on his clock and the certainty of a man who believed he had just taken back control of the situation. He had not. Tomorrow morning, William Carter was going to sit across a table from Eleanor Caldwell. And Carter, whatever his faults, was a man who could read a room. He was going to look at the evidence she put in front of him. And he was going to make a calculation, and Eleanor had built the case carefully enough that the calculation was going to have only one reasonable conclusion. And then, one way or another, the walls around Robert Haverford were going to start coming down. She straightened the papers on the desk, stacked them neatly, and blew out the lamp. She had not ironed a wedding dress since the morning this all began. She had not thought about her family's house, or her father's silence, or the sound of Olivia's laughter carrying through the walls of a room she was never quite included in. She thought about those things now, briefly, the way you think about a country you have left, not with longing. Not exactly. With the particular clarity of distance. She had been the invisible daughter, the useful one. The one who kept the books while everyone else looked elsewhere. She was still keeping the books. The difference was that now, the books were hers, and what they told was a story she intended to finish on her own terms. Carter was already awake when they came for him. Eleanor had not expected that. She had expected to find him slow with sleep, caught off guard. His defenses not yet assembled for the day. Instead, he was dressed and sitting at the small table in his quarters with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been waiting not with anxiety, but with the settled patience of someone who had known this morning was coming and had decided how he was going to handle it. That told her something. She sat across from him without being invited. Nathaniel stood to her left, slightly back, which was exactly where she had asked him to stand, present enough to establish authority. Far enough back to make clear that this was her conversation. Carter looked at Nathaniel first, then at Eleanor. His expression did not change. Mrs. Caldwell, he said. Mr. Carter. She set the folder on the table between them. Did not open it. Just set it there. I want to tell you what I know. And then I want to hear what you have to say. Is that acceptable? I reckon I don't have much choice in the matter. You have more choice than you think, she said. That's actually the point of this conversation. He looked at the folder. Back at her. He picked up his coffee and took a slow drink. And she let him, because a man who needed a moment to compose himself was a man who was still calculating. And a man still calculating had not yet decided to be difficult. The supplier payments first, she said. 4 years of invoices recorded at amounts higher than the filed receipts. The difference averages $11 per transaction. Over 4 years and the volume of transactions this estate runs. The accumulated gap is substantial. She paused. I have every transaction documented. Carter said nothing. The yield records. 3 sections reported below actual production for at least 3 consecutive harvests. The drainage explanation you gave me during our field walk does not appear in any maintenance log. Labor record or materials purchase for the relevant period. She paused. There was no drainage problem. Still nothing. The promissory note, she said. Something moved in Carter's face. Small, controlled. But there, signed in Mr. Caldwell's name. Dated October 1815. Notarized by Daniel Fitch, the signature is not Mr. Caldwell's. I have documented the specific points of variance against his verified signatures on the 1814 purchase documents, which Fitch also notarized. She kept her voice level and steady. You removed the original from the East Room archive while I was in Charlottesville. I had already made a copy, and the attestation filing in the county records office confirms the note's existence independently. So the note is documented whether or not the original is produced. She paused. The note is made payable to Robert Haverford. The adjusted per agreement entries in the estate ledgers, which are in your handwriting, correspond to payments made against that note over 4 years. Carter set his coffee down. Now Eleanor said, here is what I don't know yet. I don't know whether you helped create the forged note or whether Haverford brought it to you as an existing document and presented it as legitimate. I don't know whether Fitch was a willing participant or whether his seal was used without his knowledge. And I don't know what Haverford told you, what he threatened, what he promised, what arrangement he made with you that kept you paying against a document for 4 years without bringing it to the man who actually owned this estate. She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Carter looked at the folder on the table for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he's turning something over and not quite ready to spit it out. What happens if I talk to you, he said finally. That depends on what you tell me. If you were coerced, if Haverford used the note or something else to compel your cooperation, that's a different situation than if you participated willingly. She paused. I'm not a judge and I'm not a lawyer. I can't make you promises about what a court will do. But I can tell you that a man who comes forward voluntarily, who provides full information, who assists in building a case against the primary actor, that man is in a considerably different position than a man who is dragged into a courtroom and forced to answer. And if I don't talk to you, then everything I have goes to a lawyer named Foster, who arrives from Richmond within the week, and it goes from Foster to a judge. And you answer the questions in front of people with considerably less flexibility than I have. She held his gaze. I'm offering you the better option, Mr. Carter. I won't offer it twice. Carter was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him without expression, without anger visible, without anything that gave Carter a read on whether there was mercy available from that direction. Carter looked back at Eleanor. Haverford came to me in the spring of 1815, he said. 8 months after the sale. He told me Caldwell had cheated him. Said the terms of the sale had been misrepresented. That Caldwell had concealed the value of certain assets to drive the price down. A pause. He said he had legal recourse, but that pursuing it formally would take years and cost more than it was worth. He wanted a private resolution. The payments, Eleanor said. He said it was what he was owed, just recovering what had been taken. Carter's hands were flat on the table. He had the note, said it was documentation of the debt Caldwell had acknowledged privately. Said Caldwell had signed it before deciding to fight the claim instead. He paused. I believed him. At first. When did you stop believing him? A long pause. When I looked at the signature, the room went very still. You knew it was forged, Eleanor said. I suspected it. After the first year, I'd seen enough of Caldwell's signature on estate documents to know it wasn't quite right. Carter's voice was flat and even. The voice of a man who had been holding something for a long time and was putting it down. But by then I'd been making payments for a year. If I came forward, I'd have to explain why I'd been paying against a document I suspected was false. And Haverford, he stopped. What did Haverford have on you? Eleanor said quietly. Another pause, longer. There was money, before Caldwell bought the estate. When Haverford was still the owner, some of it moved through accounts I managed. He met her eyes. Not all of it was accounted for properly. You were taking from Haverford the same way you were taking from Caldwell. Smaller amounts. Different methods. He looked at his hands. Haverford found out. Instead of dismissing me, he used it. Said if I kept the payments going, he'd keep quiet about the earlier irregularities. If I stopped or if I told Caldwell, he'd bring everything forward. The earlier theft plus the payments. Make it look like I'd been running the same scheme under both owners. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. The full architecture of it was becoming visible now. Haverford had not just used Carter as a tool. He had trapped him, created a structure where Carter's own past made him unable to extricate himself without destroying himself in the process. It was patient and it was precise, and it was the work of a man who understood leverage. The brother-in-law, she said. James Pruitt, on the county land board. Carter looked up sharply. Was Pruitt involved in directing Nathaniel toward my family's estate? A silence that answered the question before Carter did. Haverford asked Pruitt to make the introduction. Carter said slowly. He wanted someone in the Caldwell household who could manage the accounts in a way that was favorable. He thought a wife, the right kind, might be more tractable. Then he stopped. More tractable than a husband who was already fighting him, Eleanor finished. Yes, she kept her expression even. She filed the cold anger somewhere useful. Haverford chose my family. He arranged for Nathaniel to be directed toward us. He expected me to be a domestic presence who wouldn't look at the books closely. She paused. Or he expected it to be Olivia, who certainly wouldn't have. Carter said nothing. Which was its own answer. He didn't count on the arrangement being contested, Eleanor said. He didn't count on which sister actually came. No, Carter said quietly. I don't reckon he did. She gave Carter 24 hours. Not out of generosity, out of strategy. She needed him to go to Haverford, needed Haverford to believe that Carter had handled the situation. Bought more time, kept Eleanor's investigation contained. A Carter who disappeared from the estate overnight would tell Haverford that something had broken. A Carter who continued his normal routine, reported back that the new wife was manageable. Gave Haverford a false sense of security that was worth 24 hours. She explained this to Nathaniel afterward in the study. He was quiet for a moment. You're using Carter as a messenger. I'm using Carter as a delay tactic. There's a difference. She sat down. Haverford sent that 30-day notice because he thinks he's moving faster than we are. If Carter tells him something that slows him down, we gain time for Foster to arrive and the legal case to be formally prepared. And Carter agreed to this. Carter agreed because his alternative is to stand beside Haverford in front of a judge and answer for 4 years of payments against a forged document while also answering for the supplier fraud. She paused. He is a man who can read a situation. He read it. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. You trust him to deliver the right message. I trust him to deliver a message that serves his own interests. Which, for the next 24 hours, means keeping Haverford calm. She met his eyes. I don't need him to be honest. I need him to be self-interested. Those are much more reliable. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. That look again, the one she was still mapping, the one that lived just past the edge of his usual control. He looked away before she could read it fully. Foster arrives Thursday, he said. Good. She opened the folder on the desk. Then I have 2 days to finish the documentation. I want everything organized so that when Foster sits down with it, he needs no more than an hour to understand the complete picture. Is there anything you need from me? She looked up. The question was simple, direct, without any quality of performance. He asked it the way he asked most things, as if the answer mattered, and he intended to act on it. Yes, she said. I need the original 1,814 purchase correspondence. Any letters you exchanged with Haverford before the sale was finalized. If he misrepresented the estate's condition in writing, I want that documented alongside the fraud case. She paused. It strengthens the picture of who Haverford is. A man who lies in a land sale to a buyer and then constructs a fraudulent claim against that same buyer is not a man who made one mistake. He's a man with a pattern. Nathaniel was already moving toward the cabinet. I kept everything, he said. I keep all correspondence. I know, she said. I found that out in the first hour. He stopped. Looked back up at her. It's an observation, she said. Though in this case they're the same thing. Foster arrived on Wednesday evening, a day earlier than expected. He was a compact, precise man in his late 40s, who had the look of someone who slept well and ate simply and spent the majority of his waking hours thinking about legal problems. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the door, looked at Eleanor with careful attention rather than the usual dismissive courtesy. And when she handed him the organized case file 20 minutes later, he sat down and read it without speaking for the better part of an hour. Eleanor waited. Nathaniel waited. Neither of them talked, which Foster would later say was the first sign that these were people worth working with. When Foster set the file down, he looked at Eleanor. You compiled this, he said. It was not a question. Yes. In how long? 8 days. He was quiet for a moment. The comparison signatures are particularly well documented. The notary issue is the strongest point. Fitch notarized both, which gives us a direct evidentiary comparison that any judge can follow without specialized knowledge. He tapped the attestation copy from Charlottesville. And this filing confirms the note's existence without requiring the original, which addresses the missing document problem. He looked at her. Where did you get your training? 12 years of managing a family estate, she said. And paying attention. Foster looked at Nathaniel. Your wife is more useful to you than I am. I'm aware of that, Nathaniel said. Then why did you send for me? Because she asked me to, Nathaniel said. And because she's right that this needs a lawyer. Foster turned back to Eleanor. What's your strategy? She laid it out for him. The 30-day notice from Haverford. The plan to file a counterclaim establishing fraud before Haverford could get his preliminary hearing. The use of Carter's testimony to establish the coercion element and the longer timeline of the scheme. The Charlottesville records to document Haverford's connection to Fitch. The purchase correspondence to establish the pattern. Foster listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. It's sound. We'll need to move quickly on the counterclaim file within the week to get ahead of his hearing application. He paused. Carter. How reliable is he? Reliable enough. He's not doing this out of conscience, he's doing it because his options are limited. But the account he gave is consistent with the documentary evidence in ways that are specific enough to be credible. She paused. He knew about the forgery. That's going to cost him. But his cooperation is worth more to us than his prosecution at this stage. Agreed, Foster said. He stood. I'll need a full day with these documents in your desk. He looked at Eleanor. And I'll need you available for questions. I'll be here, she said. The letter from her father arrived the following morning. She almost didn't open it. She stood in the hall with it in her hand and looked at her father's handwriting, on the outside the same handwriting she had watched sign documents her entire life. The same handwriting she had imitated at 14 to practice. Because she had wanted to understand how a signature became authority and felt the familiar weight of it settle on her chest. She opened it. It was not a long letter. Her father was not a man who wrote long letters. He wrote short ones that said very little and implied a great deal. And this one was no exception. He wrote that he had heard she was well settled at the Caldwell estate. He wrote that the family had been through a difficult period, following that he used the word disruption at the church. He wrote that Olivia was recovering. He wrote that he hoped Eleanor understood that everything her family had been in service of what they believed was best for everyone involved. And then, in the last paragraph, he wrote that the Whitaker estate was facing some financial pressures. Nothing insurmountable, he wrote, but he wondered whether Eleanor, in her new position, might be able to speak to her husband about the possibility of some arrangement that could assist the family during this period of difficulty. She read the last paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter along its original creases, set it on the hall table, and went back to the study where Foster was working. She sat at the secondary desk and picked up her pen and did not think about the letter for 2 hours. She was good at that. She had been practicing it her whole life. At midday she went out to the kitchen and found Mrs. Albright supervising the lunch preparation and stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "My father has written asking for financial assistance." Mrs. Albright looked at her. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. It was the most honest thing she had said all week. She went back to work. She thought about it in the margins of the afternoon, in the spaces between cross-referencing documents and answering Foster's questions and reviewing the draft counterclaim language that Foster had begun preparing. She thought about her father's face at the wedding. The pride and the calculation running together, indistinguishable from each other. She thought about her mother's voice in the garden. She thought about Olivia in the white silk dress. She did not think about whether they deserved help. That was not the right question, and she knew it. The right question was what she could live with. And that was a question she needed more time to answer. She was still thinking about it when Nathaniel found her at 4:30, sitting in the chair by the east room window with her pen in her hand and nothing written on the paper in front of her. He sat in the chair across from her, without asking if this was a good time. She had come to appreciate that about him. He didn't ask questions he could answer by observation. "Your father's letter," he said. "You saw it. It was on the hall table." She looked at the blank paper. "He wants money. He wants me to ask you for it." A pause. "On the family's behalf. I see I haven't decided what to answer." She looked at him. "I want to be clear that this is my decision, not yours. I'm not asking you to make it." He nodded once. "I'm also not going to make it quickly," she said. "And I'm not going to make it out of guilt or habit or the particular kind of obligation that is just guilt with better manners." "That seems right," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me what you think I should do?" "No." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you don't need me to." And because stopped. Started again. "Because the way you make decisions is one of the things I never stop." He looked at the window. It would be wrong to interfere with that. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window with the expression of a man who had said slightly more than he intended, and was deciding whether to acknowledge it or let it pass. She let it pass, but she kept it. "My father's letter is a separate matter from what's happening with Haverford," she said. "I'm not going to let one affect the other." "I know," he said. "Foster thinks we can file the counterclaim by Friday. He told me, if we file Friday and Haverford's hearing application hasn't been processed yet, we may be able to consolidate the proceedings, make the fraud case the primary matter rather than the debt claim." She paused. "Which is where it belongs." Nathaniel nodded. He was looking at her again. "When this is over," he said. She waited. When Haverford is dealt with and Foster goes back to Richmond and the estate accounts are running correctly. He paused. I'd like to discuss the management of the estate formally. Not just the emergency. The ongoing management. He paused again. I'd like you to have a formal role, not as my wife reviewing the accounts, as the person responsible for them, with full authority. Eleanor looked at him. That's not a common arrangement, she said. No. People will have things to say about it. People had things to say about the wedding, he said. We survived that. She looked at the blank paper in front of her. She thought about 12 years of managing a household that was not hers. Keeping books for an estate that did not recognize her contribution. Being useful in ways that were consumed without acknowledgement. She thought about the difference between being used and being trusted. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He stood. He was at the door when she said Nathaniel. He turned. The thing you stopped yourself from saying, she said. About the way I make decisions. He looked at her. His expression was completely controlled, and underneath it was something that was not controlled at all. It keeps, he said. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. He left. She picked up her pen and began to write. The counterclaim was filed on Friday. Haverford received his copy on Saturday morning. Eleanor knew this because Carter sent word a brief, unsigned note delivered by a stable boy from a tavern in town that said only that Haverford had read the filing and had not been calm about it. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the visitor who arrived Saturday afternoon. She heard the carriage on the drive and looked up from the desk and went to the hall. And when the door opened, it was not a stranger, and it was not a message from Foster, and it was not anything she had planned for. It was Olivia. Her sister stood in the doorway of the Caldwell house in a good traveling coat and a face that had lost the bright, effortless quality Eleanor had watched her entire life. Olivia was still beautiful, that had not changed, but she looked older than she had 3 weeks ago. In the way that people sometimes aged years, in the space of a month when circumstances required it. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at her. I came alone, Olivia said. Father doesn't know I'm here. Come in, Eleanor said. She said it because it was the right thing to say, and because she was not a person who let the past make decisions she hadn't examined first. She said it, and she stood back, and Olivia came inside and stood in the hall of the house that would have been hers if things had gone differently, and looked around with the expression of someone who is looking at an alternative version of their life and trying to understand how they feel about it. You look well, Olivia said. I am well, Eleanor said. Sit down. They sat in the front room, which was the closest room and not a choice Eleanor made for any symbolic reason. Olivia kept her coat on. Eleanor did not offer tea right away. There were things that needed to be said before tea. Father's written to you, Olivia said. Yes, he wrote because of the debts. They're worse than he told you in the letter. Olivia looked at her hands. He owes money to 3 different creditors. The Southfield harvest was poor this year, genuinely poor. Not managed accounts, just a bad season. And after what happened at the church, there are social costs. She paused. People have been less willing to extend credit. Less willing to do business. She looked up. It's my fault. I know that. Eleanor was quiet. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Olivia said. I'm not even sure I'm asking you to help him. I came because I thought you deserved to hear the truth of it, from someone who would actually tell you. Instead of from Father's letter, which told you about a quarter of it. What's the other 3/4? Olivia told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was worse than the letter. Not ruinous, not yet, but without intervention, within a year or 2 it would be. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. When Olivia finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about what Nathaniel had not said in the East Room. She thought about the 12 years of books, and the silence at the breakfast table, and the dress with the pearl collar. She thought about what she could live with. I'm not going to ask Nathaniel to rescue Father's estate, she said finally. That's not something I'm willing to do. And it's not something I would do regardless of what Father asked. Olivia nodded. She had expected that. But there are things I can do within my own authority, Eleanor said. I have knowledge of estate management that your father's current situation needs. I can review the accounts. I can identify where the losses are recoverable and where they aren't. I can suggest a plan, not as a gift. As a professional engagement. If Father wants my help, he engages my help the way he would engage anyone with the relevant expertise. She paused again. With my name on the work. Olivia stared at her. He won't like that, I know, Eleanor said. That's the condition. Olivia was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face, something genuine. Without the social performance, Eleanor had spent her whole life watching from the outside. You're different, Olivia said. No, Eleanor said. I'm exactly the same. You're just seeing me properly for the first time. Olivia looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands. I'm sorry, she said. For the dress, for all of it, it landed simply. Without drama. Without the careful management of the way Olivia usually moved through the world. Eleanor looked at her sister. She looked at the person who had taken the dress and the flowers and the place at the altar. And she looked for the anger she had expected to feel and found something else there instead. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of a space where forgiveness might eventually live. I know, she said. Olivia nodded. It was enough. She seemed to know it was enough. They had tea after that. It was not comfortable, and it was not warm, not in the way it might have been if things had been different between them. But it was honest, and Eleanor had decided long ago that honest was worth more than comfortable in almost every situation. When Olivia left an hour later, Eleanor stood in the hall and listened to the carriage go down the drive and felt the full weight of the day settle over her Foster's counterclaim filed. Haverford shaken, Carter cooperating, Olivia in that chair saying I'm sorry like she meant it. Her father's estate in worse shape than the letter had admitted. Nathaniel's unfinished sentence keeping in the East Room. She went back to the study. She picked up her pen. She had work to do, and Haverford had not yet been fully dismantled. And the estate accounts for the coming spring needed to be planned. And there was a letter to her father that was going to require very careful wording. But for one moment she sat in the chair where she had sat for 8 days now. In the house that was hers, at the desk that was hers, with the books that were hers, and let herself feel the shape of it. Not triumph, not yet, something quieter than that. The feeling of finally standing on ground that held. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of March. Foster had filed the counterclaim on Friday, and by Monday morning the court had consolidated the proceedings. Which meant that Haverford's 30-day debt notice and the Caldwell fraud case would be heard together before the same judge. That was exactly what Eleanor had wanted. It meant that the debt claim, the thing Haverford had built his strategy around, would be examined in the same room and at the same moment as the evidence that it was fraudulent. He would not get his preliminary hearing in isolation. He would not get to establish the note as legitimate before anyone looked closely at its origins. He would walk into that courtroom carrying a weapon that was going to be taken apart in front of him. Foster explained this to Eleanor and Nathaniel on Monday afternoon. And when he finished, Nathaniel looked at Eleanor and said, "That's what you planned for. That's what I hoped for," she said. "There's a difference. Not much of one in this case." Foster cleared his throat. "There's something you both need to know before Tuesday." He looked at his papers. "Haverford has retained counsel, a man named Aldrich from Richmond. He's good. He's not but he's experienced and he's aggressive, and he will try to discredit the comparative signature analysis on the grounds that it was prepared by a party with a personal interest in the outcome." "Meaning me," Eleanor said. "Meaning you." Foster looked at her directly. "He's going to argue that you assembled the documentation with the intention of protecting your husband's estate, and that your analysis is therefore partial." "My analysis is accurate," she said. I know that. The question is whether the judge will give it full weight against an objection from Aldrich. He paused. I want to bring in a second opinion. A man in Richmond who does document examination professionally. I've already written to him. He can be here by Monday evening to review your comparison work and provide an independent corroboration. Will he agree with my conclusions? If your conclusions are correct. Yes, they're correct, she said. Then he'll agree with them, Foster said. And Aldrich's objection falls apart. Eleanor nodded. Do it. Foster looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. You don't need my approval for that, Nathaniel said to Foster. She just gave it. The document examiner arrived Monday evening. His name was Whitfield, and he was 60 years old, and had the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had spent 4 decades looking at things other people had missed. He sat with Eleanor's comparison work for 2 hours, asking occasional precise questions, making notes in a hand so small she could barely read it over his shoulder. At the end of the 2 hours, he set down his pen and looked at her. Where did you learn to do this? He said. I looked carefully, she said. And I wrote down what I saw. He was quiet for a moment. The analysis is correct. The signature on the promissory note is not the same hand as the verified signatures. The variance in the capital N alone is conclusive. But you've documented 11 additional points of difference, which is more than sufficient. He tapped the page. This is better work than I've seen from men who do this professionally. Will you say so in court? That's why I'm here, he said. Eleanor thanked him and went to find Nathaniel and told him it was going to be all right. She said it plainly, without drama, because that was how she said things that mattered. And because she believed it. He looked at her for a moment. You've been certain this whole time, he said. No, she said. I've been prepared this whole time. There's a difference. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him, and she found that she wanted to see it completed. Which was a thought she set aside for later, the way she set aside everything that required more time than she currently had. The courtroom in Charlottesville was full on Tuesday morning. Eleanor had not expected that. She had thought it would be a sparse legal proceeding, a judge, the lawyers, the parties involved, a few observers. Instead, the room was filled with people she recognized. County residents, landowners, people who had attended the wedding 6 weeks ago and had been talking about it ever since, and who had apparently decided that the next chapter of the Caldwell story was worth a day of their time. She walked in beside Nathaniel and kept her eyes forward and did not look at the faces in the gallery. Haverford was already seated at the opposing table. She saw him before he saw her, which she considered an advantage. He was exactly as she had observed outside his office in Charlottesville, precise dresser. Deliberate posture, the held confidence of a man who had been waiting a long time to get back something he believed was his. He had a lawyer at his elbow, a broad-shouldered man with an aggressive set to his jaw whom she took to be Aldrich. Haverford looked at her when she sat down. She met his eyes without expression and looked away first by choice. Not by instinct, in the way you look away from something that is not worth the extended attention. The judge entered. The proceedings began. Aldrich moved immediately. Before Foster had finished his opening statement, Aldrich was on his feet with an objection to the admissibility of the comparative signature analysis on the grounds of interested party bias. He was smooth and fast, and he framed it well, not as an attack on Eleanor's intelligence or competence, but as a principled legal argument about the standards of evidentiary impartiality. The judge looked at Foster. Foster stood, Your Honor. The comparative analysis prepared by Mrs. Caldwell has been independently reviewed and corroborated by Mr. James Whitfield of Richmond, a professional document examiner with 40 years of experience in this court and others. Mr. Whitfield is present and prepared to testify to his independent conclusions. A pause. The objection addresses the analyst. It does not address the analysis. And the analysis has been independently confirmed. Aldrich started to rise again. The judge held up one hand. The objection is noted. The evidence will be admitted. Mr. Whitfield will testify. He looked at both tables. Let's proceed. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap and her face entirely still, and let out a breath so slow and controlled that no one watching her would have known she had been holding it. The first hour was documentation. Foster walked the judge through the ledger, records the supplier discrepancies, the yield falsifications, the accumulated financial damage to the Caldwell estate over 4 years. He was methodical and precise, and he did not editorialize. He let the numbers speak, which was exactly what Eleanor had built them to do. Aldrich cross-examined on the yield records, trying to establish that weather and market variation could account for the discrepancies without any fraudulent intent. He was competent. He punched holes where holes existed and minimized what he could minimize. Eleanor watched the judge watch Aldrich and noted that the judge's expression did not soften. That was useful information. The second hour was the promissory note. Foster presented the Charlottesville attestation first, the official filing that documented the note's existence. Its date, its amount, its stated parties. Then the copy Eleanor had made, with her notations. Then Whitfield, who took the stand and spoke for 45 minutes in the careful, specific language of a man who had done this many times, documenting 11 points of variance between the forged signature and Nathaniel's verified signatures, explaining each one in terms clear enough that anyone in the room could follow. Aldrich crossed. He challenged Whitfield's methodology. He challenged the reliance on a copy rather than an original. He challenged the weight to be given to signature analysis in general. Whitfield answered each challenge with the unhurried patience of a man who had been challenged before and found the experience neither threatening nor interesting. His answers were short and precise, and each one closed the door Aldrich had tried to open. When Aldrich sat down, the expression on Haverford's face had changed. It was not the expression he had walked in with. It was the expression of a man who has been watching the floor he was standing on and has just noticed the cracks. He leaned to Aldrich and said something. Aldrich shook his head slightly. Haverford said something else. Aldrich put a hand flat on the table, the gesture of a lawyer telling a client to stop talking. Eleanor watched this and kept her face entirely neutral and thought, "There it is." Carter took the stand after the midday recess. He was not a comfortable witness. He was not designed for it, a man of his type, who had built his whole life on the management of appearances, found the witness stand a particularly hostile environment because it removed the ability to manage what the other person saw. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and his jaw set and answered Foster's questions in a flat, careful voice that had shed most of its usual authority. He told the truth. Not because he was a man of conscience. Eleanor had not built her strategy on his conscience. He told the truth because Foster had made the calculation transparent to him. The truth, voluntarily given, positioned Carter as a man who had been coerced and had ultimately come forward. The alternative positioned him as a full and willing participant in a 4-year fraud scheme. Carter had chosen correctly. He described Haverford's approach in the spring of 1815. The presentation of the note as a legitimate debt. The gradual revelation that it was not. The threat involving Carter's own earlier financial irregularities. The 4 years of payments made under a structure designed to protect Haverford's distance from the scheme. Aldrich's cross-examination of Carter was fierce. He attacked Carter's credibility, rightly so. Eleanor thought, because Carter's credibility was genuinely limited and Aldrich was doing his job. He pointed out that Carter was a self-admitted thief, testifying in exchange for reduced consequences, which was accurate, and that his account of Haverford's role was uncorroborated by any documentary evidence, which was also accurate. Foster rose for redirect. Mr. Carter, the payments you described making to Haverford, were those payments recorded in the estate ledgers? Yes. Under what notation? Adjusted per agreement. In whose handwriting? Mine. And the initials beneath those notations? Mine. W.C. Were there other initials present in some of those notations? Carter paused for the length of one breath. Yes. Whose? Robert Haverford. The gallery made a sound. The judge looked up. Aldrich was on his feet, but the damage was already in the room. Already in the air. Already sitting in every mind present. Haverford's own initials, in the estate ledgers, in Carter's notations. In the handwriting of a man who had been on that property for 17 years. Aldrich objected to the characterization. The judge sustained it on narrow grounds. It did not matter. The jury of public opinion that was sitting in the gallery had heard what they had heard. And in Albemarle County, Virginia in the year 1817, what the community understood was frequently more consequential than what a court formally established. Eleanor had known that. She had planned for that too. The twist came at 2:30 in the afternoon. And it came from a direction she had not anticipated. Aldrich called a witness. The witness was Daniel Fitch. Eleanor sat up very slightly. Beside her, she felt Nathaniel go still. Foster made a small, controlled sound that was not quite a word. Fitch was a small man in his 60s with a careful manner and the look of someone who had recently been very frightened and had decided that the best way through it was to appear as unremarkable as possible. He took the stand. He was sworn. Aldrich led him through a brief, structured account. Fitch stated that he had notarized the promissory note in October of 1815. That he had done so in good faith, presented with what appeared to be a legitimate debt document with a completed signature. That he had no reason at the time to suspect the signature was not genuine. Aldrich turned to the judge with the expression of a man making a legal point. The notarization, he argued, had been performed in good faith by a legitimate notary. The note, whatever questions existed about the signature itself, had been processed through proper legal channels by a man with no knowledge of any fraud. This complicated the fraud claim significantly, Aldrich said, because good faith notarization created a presumption of legitimacy that required more than a comparative analysis to overcome. It was, Eleanor acknowledged silently, a good move. It didn't destroy her case. Whitfield's analysis was still in the record. Carter's testimony was still in the record, but it introduced a layer of ambiguity that Aldrich was hoping would be enough to muddy the waters around a clean fraud finding. Foster stood for cross-examination of Fitch. Mr. Fitch, Foster said, you state that you notarized the promissory note in good faith. I did. Had you previously notarized documents for Mr. Haverford? On several occasions, yes. Had you previously notarized documents bearing Caldwell's signature? A pause. Yes. I notarized the original land transfer documents in 1814. So you had seen Mr. Caldwell's signature before? I had, yes. And when you notarized the promissory note in October of 1815 with Mr. Caldwell's purported signature already on the document, did you compare that signature to the one you had witnessed a year earlier on the land transfer? A longer pause. Mr. Fitch, Foster said, keeping his voice entirely pleasant. It's a yes or no question, I know, Fitch said. I did not make a direct comparison. Is it standard practice? When notarizing a document bearing the signature of a known party, to verify that signature against a previously witnessed example. Another pause. It can be done. Is it standard practice? It is recommended. In cases of significant financial instruments. And a promissory note for this amount would qualify as a significant financial instrument. Fitch looked at his hands. Yes, so standard recommended practice in your own field would have been to compare the signature before notarizing. And you did not do so. Foster paused. No further questions. Fitch left the stand looking considerably smaller than he had arrived. Aldrich did not recall him. Eleanor looked at Haverford. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the table in front of him with the fixed, inward expression of a man running calculations and finding the numbers wrong in every direction. She turned back to the front of the courtroom and waited for what came next. What came next was Haverford himself. Aldrich did not call him. Foster did. It was the boldest move Foster had made. And he had discussed it with Eleanor the night before. Calling an opposing party as a hostile witness was a calculated risk. It gave Aldrich the opportunity to rehabilitate Haverford on redirect. And it put a man who was skilled at managing appearances directly in front of the judge with the opportunity to perform. But it also meant that every question Foster asked would be answered under oath. And Haverford had been building his strategy on a lie for 4 years, which meant there were specific places where the truth and his story could not coexist. Eleanor had identified those places. She had given them to Foster in a list of 7 questions. Foster asked all 7. The first 5 Haverford answered with the controlled smoothness of a man who had prepared. His manner was reasonable. His voice was measured. He acknowledged the history between himself and Nathaniel, characterized it as a business dispute that had unfortunately become personal, expressed regret about the adversarial nature of the current proceedings. He was, as Eleanor had expected, good at this. The 6th question was about James Pruitt. Foster asked, in a tone of mild curiosity, whether Haverford had any relationship with James Pruitt of the County Land Board. Haverford said yes. Pruitt was his brother-in-law. They saw each other at family occasions. Foster asked whether Haverford had ever discussed the Caldwell estate with Pruitt in a professional capacity. Haverford said no, they kept family and business separate. Foster nodded pleasantly and moved to the 7th question. Mr. Haverford, were you aware, at the time the promissory note was executed in October of 1815, that the signature on that document was not Mr. Caldwell's genuine signature? The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Eleanor counted them. No, Haverford said. I was not. You were presented with that document by another party? I was, and you accepted it as genuine? I had no reason to doubt it. Who presented it to you? A pause. I don't recall precisely. You don't recall who brought you a promissory note for a significant sum of money? It was some years ago. Business involved many documents, Mr. Haverford. Foster's voice remained pleasant. William Carter has testified that you approached him directly in the spring of 1815 and presented the note as documentation of a debt you claimed, Mr. Caldwell had privately acknowledged. If your testimony is that the note was brought to you by a third party, you are directly contradicting Mr. Carter's account. A pause. Which version is true? The courtroom was so quiet Eleanor could hear the winter wind outside. Haverford looked at Aldrich. Aldrich's expression gave him nothing. Haverford looked at the judge. The judge waited. Haverford started. Stopped. The circumstances of that period were complex. Haverford, the judge said, not uncommon. Please answer the question. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Not a thinking silence. A cornered silence. The silence of a man who has been running a story for 4 years and has just found himself in a room where the story has no exit. I approached Carter, Haverford said finally. His voice was flat, emptied of its earlier smoothness. I brought the note to Carter. The note that you claim was brought to you by an unknown third party. Yes, so you had the note before your approach to Carter. Yes, where obtain it? Another long pause. Then very quietly, almost inaudible, I had it prepared. The gallery erupted. The judge called for order. Aldrich was on his feet with an objection, and then appeared to think better of it and sat down again. Because there was no procedural objection that undid what had just been said. And a lawyer who objected to his own client's confession looked worse than a lawyer who absorbed it. Eleanor did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Haverford. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and breathed slowly in through her nose and out through her mouth, and let the room reorganize itself around what had just happened. Beside her, Nathaniel's hand, which had been resting on the table, moved very slightly. His fingers came to rest against hers. Not a grasp, not a gesture for the gallery, just a point of contact. Present and steady and without performance. She turned her hand over briefly and pressed back. Then she folded her hands again and looked at the front of the courtroom and waited for the judge. The judgment came the following morning. The fraud finding was unambiguous. The promissory note was declared void. The 4 years of payments made against it were ruled recoverable from Haverford as restitution. The judge referred the matter of Fitch's inadequate notarization practice to the professional body responsible for such oversight. James Pruitt's role was noted in the judgment as warranting separate inquiry by the County Land Board. Carter's cooperation was taken into account. His sentence, when it came, reflected it not absolution, but the difference between a man who had come forward and one who had not. Haverford's legal practice in Charlottesville did not survive the year. Eleanor heard that later from Foster, who wrote to her in April with the final details of the restitution calculation. She read the letter at the study desk and noted it and filed it, and went back to the spring planting schedule she had been reviewing. The estate accounts for the first full season under Eleanor's formal management showed a 19% improvement in yield across the south and west sections. She had made 3 changes to the rotation schedule, renegotiated the primary grain supplier contract, and replaced the labor tracking system with one that matched actual hours to recorded pay which, in the first quarter alone, recovered funds that had been disappearing for years. She did not announce these results. She put them in the quarterly summary she prepared for Nathaniel. And he read it, and he came to find her in the study afterward. 19%, he said. The land was being underworked, she said. The rotation wasn't suited to the soil composition in the lower sections. It wasn't a difficult fix once the records were accurate. He looked at the summary in his hand. The workers. They work harder when they're paid correctly, she said. That's not a complicated observation. He set the summary down. He looked at her with the expression she had been mapping for 2 months now, and had finally, she thought, come close to understanding. It was not admiration in the distant, formal sense. It was something more personal than that. Something that had been building in the specific way things build between 2 people who spend their days working alongside each other towards the same end and have started, without quite deciding to fit together. Eleanor, he said. She looked at him. The thing I stopped myself from saying, he said. In the East Room. She waited. I was going to say that the way you make decisions is one of the things I find myself. He stopped. He was not a man who found these words easily, and she had learned not to rush him when he was looking for them, because what he eventually said was always worth the wait. I have not known many people I trusted without reservation. I have not known many people whose judgment I would follow into a courtroom on the strength of 8 days' work. He paused. I have not known many people who I thought, in the particular way I think this, that I would very much like to continue knowing for a long time. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about all the mornings she had sat in this study before dawn with a candle and a ledger. She thought about Olivia's letter last week, which had been shorter than the first and warmer, asking for Eleanor's opinion on a household account question with the tone of a person who had decided to start over from a different place. She thought about her father's estate, where she'd spent 3 days last month reviewing the accounts on the terms she had set her name on the work. Her conclusions final, and had identified 2 recoverable debt positions that her father's advisors had missed entirely. She thought about the woman who had stood outside a church in February cold, counting bell strikes, convinced she was past the point of hoping for anything particular from the world. She looked at Nathaniel Caldwell and thought about how wrong that woman had been. I think, she said, that you have been trying to say that for quite some time. Since the carriage ride, he said. More or less. Since the carriage ride, she said. When we talked about drainage and soil composition, a man falls in love with what he falls in love with, he said. I reckon soil composition is as good a place as any to start. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up from behind the desk and crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up slightly, which was not a position she occupied comfortably in general, and did not mind at all in this specific instance. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said. He looked at her. That almost smile finally completed itself, unhurried and genuine, and worth every one of the months she had spent watching it arrive. His hand came up and touched her face with the same care and precision he brought to everything that mattered to him. And she leaned into it the way she leaned into good solid ground. And for a long time neither of them said anything at all. 1 year after a February wedding that nearly didn't happen. The Caldwell estate was the most productive operation in Albemarle County. 3 neighboring landowners had come to Eleanor for consulting advice on their own accounts. She had taken 2 of those engagements on her own terms, under her own name, with Nathaniel's complete support, and the frank acknowledgement from both of them that her work was the work, and her name should be on it. Mrs. Albright had received a formal raise and a title head of household, which she accepted without ceremony, and wore with the quiet dignity of a woman who had been doing the job for years and was glad someone had finally noticed. Josiah had been made estate steward, a position that suited him, and that he performed with the same unhurried competence he had shown on a cold road to Charlottesville many months before. The study desk had been moved to a larger room. Eleanor had more ledgers than the original study could comfortably hold. On an evening in late February, the exact anniversary of the day she had stood behind an elm tree counting church bells. Eleanor was at that desk when Nathaniel came in and set a small box on top of the ledger she was reading. She looked at the box, then at him. "Open it," he said. She opened it. It was a ring. Not the Caldwell family ring, not the heavy, formal thing that represented lineage and inheritance, and the weight of other people's histories. This was something made specifically. Simple, well made, with a precision to it that reminded her of how he approached everything. "I had it made," he said. "The other one was my family's. This one is ours." She looked at it for a moment. She thought about the pearl collar on a white silk dress that had not been hers. She thought about the things that were given and the things that were earned and the considerable difference between them. She picked the ring up and put it on her own finger without waiting to be asked, which he had fully expected and would not have had any other way. "It fits," she said. "I measured carefully," he said. "You always do," she said. She looked up at him and he looked back at her. In the room that was hers, in the house that was hers, in the life she had not been given but had built document by document, question by question, early morning by early morning, with her own 2 hands and a mind that the world had spent 26 years trying to convince her was not worth much. The world had been wrong. She had always known it. Now everyone else knew it too.